In the spring of 2002, 6 months after the peak of Argentina's financial collapse, two families lived on the same street in the Palermo neighborhood of Buenos Aires. They had been neighbors for 11 years. Their children went to the same school. They had weathered the same peso devaluation, the same bank freeze, the same collapse of a government that had, in the space of 2 weeks, cycled through 5 presidents. By every external measure, they had experienced the same crisis, same city, same street, same currency, same institutions failing around them in the same sequence. Their financial situations, 6 months later, were not the same. One family had lost the majority of what they had built over 2 decades. Their savings, denominated in pesos in a domestic bank account, had been converted by government decree at a rate that did not reflect the devaluation that followed. Their small import business had collapsed when the peso fell and the cost of foreign goods became unserviceable. They were rebuilding from close to zero in a country that was itself rebuilding from close to zero. The other family had lost something too. The crisis was not kind to anyone on that street. But they had preserved enough. A portion of their assets, a functioning business relationship, a specific decision made 18 months earlier, to be operational in the spring of 2002, while their neighbors were not. What was the one thing the second family had done differently? That question, applied to Argentina in 2002, has one answer. Applied to Hungary in 1946, it has a different answer. Applied to Japan in 1945, a different answer again. Applied to Iceland in 2008, something that almost nobody predicted. Applied to Zimbabwe in the 2000s, something that does not appear in any financial planning document ever written. The answers are different every time. And yet they share something consistent enough across 100 years of national collapse that it begins to look less like luck and more like a pattern. This is what that pattern is. The Argentine answer, in the case of the second Palermo family, was property, not a portfolio of properties. One specific decision, made in late 2000 when the economic situation was deteriorating but had not yet collapsed, they had converted a portion of their peso savings into a small apartment, purchased outright in a city neighborhood with consistent rental demand. The apartment was not glamorous. It was not a sophisticated investment. It was a physical thing, denominated in something other than the peso, that generated income in whatever currency the tenant had available. When the peso was devalued and their bank account was converted at the government rate, the apartment did not participate in that conversion. It was already outside the system that the decree was reorganizing. The rental income continued. In dollars, informally. In pesos at market rates, in whatever form the tenant and landlord could agree on. The asset kept functioning because its function, shelter, in a city where people still needed to live, did not depend on the peso being stable. The surface lesson is, buy property before a crisis. That lesson is not wrong, but it is not quite the right frame. Because Hungary, the 15 months after the end of the Second World War, produced a case where the same logic led to a different outcome, and where the real lesson is hiding in what happened next. The Hungarian hyperinflation of 1945 to 1946 is, by measured rate, the most severe currency collapse in recorded history. The pengo lost value at a rate that makes the Weimar hyperinflation look gradual. At the peak, prices were doubling every 15 hours. Savings denominated in pengo reached zero in any practical sense within months. The people who had converted savings into physical productive assets before the collapse, equipment, livestock, agricultural land, workshop machinery, did preserve something through the hyperinflation itself. Their assets held value while the currency did not. By the standard logic of hard asset preservation, as they had done the one thing correctly. And then, between 1948 and 1950, the new communist government nationalized private property. Agricultural land was collectivized. Private businesses were absorbed into state enterprises. The physical productive assets that had survived the hyperinflation were, within a few years of the currency stabilizing, absorbed by the state at terms the owner did not set. The one thing that had worked in 1945 and 1946 did not work in 1950. So what did work in Hungary? What is the one thing that the historical record identifies in the families who preserved something across both the hyperinflation and the subsequent political reorganization? Skills. The same answer that keeps appearing in different forms across every case examined in this channel. Not accumulated skills in the abstract, the specific, applied, practically valued competencies that remained useful regardless of which economic system was operating. The doctor continued practicing under communism. The engineer continued building. The tradesman continued repairing. The musician continued performing. The teacher continued teaching. The asset that survived both the hyperinflation and the nationalization was the one that could not be printed into worthlessness and could not be seized by decree. It existed inside people, in a form that changed employment conditions and income levels, but never reached zero. This answer feels unsatisfying when first encountered. It sounds like a consolation. You lost everything, but at least you still had your skills. That framing is wrong. In the documented history of Hungarian recovery through the 1950s and into the gradual liberalization of the 1960s, the families that rebuilt most completely were not the ones who had best preserved financial assets across the transition. Most of those were gone regardless. They were the ones who had preserved productive relevance, whose knowledge remained useful to whoever was organizing the economy under whatever system was operating. The one thing in Hungary was not what you owned. It was what you could do that someone else needed done. Moved to Japan, August 1945, the formal surrender, the beginning of the American occupation. By that point, the Japanese economy was, in physical terms, among the most damaged of any industrial nation in the war. Major cities had been firebombed. Industrial capacity was largely destroyed or commandeered. The currency was inflating. The zaibatsu, the great industrial conglomerates, were being forcibly dissolved by occupation authorities. In that environment, the expected financial preservers, land, gold, hard assets, performed roughly as expected. Those who held them preserved more than those who held yen-denominated savings or government bonds that had been inflated into irrelevance. But the Japanese case introduces something that neither Argentina nor Hungary had surfaced as clearly. Among the merchants and small manufacturers who rebuilt fastest in the immediate post-war period, the documented common factor was not primarily financial. It was relational. The traders who had maintained trust networks, supplier relationships, customer connections, the informal web of mutual obligation and reciprocal reliability that Japanese commercial culture had built over generations, rebuilt their businesses faster than those with superior financial positions, but disrupted relationships. A merchant who had kept faith with his suppliers during the scarcity of the war years, who had not exploited short-term price advantages at the cost of long-term relationships, found those suppliers willing to extend informal credit in the immediate post-war period when formal credit was unavailable. A manufacturer who had treated workers fairly through the disruption found those workers returning and productive when reconstruction began. The relational asset, the accumulated trust of consistent behavior over time, was not listed on any balance sheet. It could not be devalued by the yen's inflation or seized by occupation decree. It was, in the specific conditions of post-war Japan, more valuable than most financial assets that had nominally survived the war. If this pattern of relational capital as a crisis survival asset, how it has appeared across different cultural and economic contexts, is something you want to understand more specifically, that is what the next video goes into directly. Here is where the pattern should feel like it is settling. Hard assets, skills, relationships, 3 cases, 3 answers. The synthesis seems close. And then Iceland arrives, and the synthesis has to be rebuilt from the ground up. In October 2008, Iceland's banking system collapsed with a speed and totality that had almost no modern parallel. The 3 major banks, with assets equivalent to roughly 10 times the country's GDP, failed within days. By any prior measure of banking crisis severity, Iceland should have experienced a decade of austerity, institutional failure, and social damage comparable to or exceeding what Greece experienced after 2010. Iceland did not experience that decade. By 2012, Iceland's economy was growing again. By 2015, unemployment had returned to pre-crisis levels. The recovery was faster than Ireland, faster than Portugal, faster than Greece, all of which had experienced less severe banking collapses by proportional measure. What was the one thing Iceland did? It let the banks fail. It did not use public money to rescue the creditors of failed private banks. The foreign depositors and bondholders who had placed money in Icelandic institutions chasing higher yields bore the losses of the institutions they had chosen to trust. Ordinary Icelandic citizens, whose domestic deposits were protected, were not taxed to make foreign creditors whole. The one thing in Iceland's case was not a behavior of individual savers. It was a national policy decision. The government chose to protect people over institutions, to allow the failure of the financial system rather than transfer that failure onto the population through austerity, to accept the short-term pain of institutional collapse in order to avoid the longer-term pain of debt-financed bailout. This is a different kind of one thing, not individual preparation, national architecture. The Icelandic recovery happened not because Icelandic individuals had done something different, but because the institutional structure they lived within made a different decision than the institutional structures in Greece, Ireland, and Portugal made, which raises a question that the individual-focused cases do not fully answer. How much of the one thing is within individual control? And how much depends on which institutional architecture surrounds you when the crisis arrives? Both matter. They are not the same. And most financial history focuses almost entirely on the individual decisions, while underweighting the institutional context that determines how much individual decisions matter. Zimbabwe, the 2000s. The hyperinflation that peaked in 2008 at rates that made meaningful measurement almost impossible. The formal economy had, by that point, effectively ceased to function. The Zimbabwean dollar was abandoned. Formal employment had collapsed. The institutional structures that normally organize economic life, banks, currency, formal contract enforcement, were operating, if at all, in a condition that bore little resemblance to their nominal function. What kept ordinary Zimbabwean families fed, housed, and economically functional during those years was not a financial instrument. It was the informal economy. The parallel systems of exchange, mutual obligation, and community trust that had always existed underneath the formal economy and continued to exist after the formal economy failed. A woman in Harare who had spent years building informal trade relationships, who knew which vendors could be trusted, which goods held value, which neighborhoods had functioning barter networks, had a more functional economic life during the peak of the hyperinflation than a professional with a formal salary that had been inflated into worthlessness. The informal economy was not a backup system that Zimbabweans constructed in response to the crisis. It had always been there. It had always been running in parallel underneath the formal institutions. When the formal institutions failed, the informal network did not need to be built. It simply became the primary system rather than the secondary one. The one thing in Zimbabwe was participation in something that existed outside the formal system, not in opposition to it, not as a hedge against it. Simply as a parallel structure that continued to function because it had never been entirely dependent on the formal system for its operation. Now look at what the 5 cases have produced. Argentina, property outside the banking system. Hungary, skills inside the person. Japan, relationships built through consistent behavior. Iceland, institutional architecture that protected people over institutions. Zimbabwe, informal networks that existed in parallel to the formal economy. 5 different answers, 5 different countries, 5 different crisis types across 8 decades of economic history. And one thing they all share. In every case, what preserved something was whatever existed outside the primary system that failed. The Argentine property was outside the peso banking system. The Hungarian skill was outside the property system that was nationalized. The Japanese relationship was outside the formal credit system that had collapsed. The Icelandic policy placed ordinary depositors outside the loss-sharing framework that absorbed the creditors. The Zimbabwean informal network was outside the formal economy that had imploded, not hidden from those systems, not opposed to them, simply not entirely dependent on them for continued function. The people who preserved something in every national collapse were not, in most cases, the ones who had predicted the collapse. They were not uniformly wealthier, or better connected, or more financially sophisticated. They were the ones who, by habit or culture or circumstance or deliberate decision, had built something, anything, that the failing system could not reach. A comeback to the 2 families on the street in Palermo, the spring of 2002, the same crisis, the same street, the different outcomes. The family that preserved something had not predicted Argentina's collapse. They had bought the apartment for reasons that had nothing to do with crisis preparation. They simply had, by the time the system failed, one thing that sat outside the system that was being reorganized by decree. The pattern is not a prediction. Most national economies do not collapse in any given decade. Most people who hold savings in domestic banks never experience a currency crisis, a nationalization, or an informal economy becoming their primary economic system. The stability of functioning institutions across most of the world and most of recorded time is real. But the pattern of who preserves something when that stability breaks is consistent enough across 100 years and 5 continents to be worth sitting with honestly. Of the financial, social, relational, and practical assets you currently hold, how many of them exist entirely within a single system? And how many of them would continue to function, to produce, to connect, to shelter, to exchange, if that system reorganized itself overnight? That question does not require a crisis to be worth answering. It only requires honesty about what you have actually built and where it sits.